I'm 88 years old, and I've watched everyone I love die. Here's the only thing that ever made the grief bearable. The last person who remembered me as a young woman died 4 years ago. And I want to tell you what that felt like, because I don't think people talk about that particular loss enough. My name is Dorothy. I'm 88 years old, and I have outlived my husband, both of my sisters, 3 of my closest friends, and more people than I can count without sitting down with a piece of paper and going through the decades one by one. And what I want to tell you is not about the dying. It's about what I found on the other side of all of it that made it possible to still be here, still be myself, still find reasons to get up in the morning and mean it. But to tell you that, I have to tell you about the grief first, because the thing that made it bearable only makes sense if you understand what it had to bear. I was born in 1936 in a small town in rural Georgia, the second of 4 children, in a family that was held together by my mother's absolute refusal to let it come apart, which required considerable daily effort, given that my father was a man of intermittent reliability and considerable charm and a relationship with whiskey that was, depending on the season and the year, more or less a problem. We were not destitute, but we were close enough to it that the proximity was a permanent feature of the landscape of my childhood, something you learn to account for the way you account for a low ceiling, by moving through life with a certain consciousness of what was just above your head. My mother was the most capable person I have ever known, and I have known many capable people across 88 years, so I want that statement to carry the weight I intend it to carry. She managed the household and 4 children, and my father's inconsistencies, and the financial shortfalls and the social expectations of a small southern town in the 1940s with a combination of genuine faith and practical intelligence and a stubbornness that she would not have called stubbornness, but that functioned as stubbornness. In every meaningful sense, the refusal to be defeated by what was defeating. She went to church every Sunday, and she prayed every night, and she believed, not in the performed sense that some people believe, but in the structural sense, the sense in which a belief is not something you do, but something you stand on, and that faith was the organizing principle of everything she did and everything she passed on to her children, intentionally or otherwise. I received it, not without complication, not without the years of questioning that I think genuine faith requires if it is going to mean anything beyond habit. But I received it, and it became, over the course of my 88 years, the thing I am going to tell you about, the thing that made the grief bearable. But I am not ready to tell you that yet, because the grief has to come first, and the grief was considerable. I married a man named Walter in 1957, when I was 21 years old, and he was 24. Walter was from a town about 40 miles from mine, the son of a Baptist minister, which told you certain things about him that were accurate and left out certain things that surprised you later, as the true character of a person always contains surprises that their background didn't fully prepare you for. He was a serious man, and a good one, steady in the way that I had not always had steady things around me growing up, and I loved him with the grateful and genuine love of a person who has been given something they had needed and not always had. We married and moved to Atlanta, where Walter had found work in accounting, and we spent the next 5 years establishing the household and the routines and the financial foundation that Walter approached with the methodical thoroughness of a man who understood the value of stability because he had watched enough people underestimate it. Yeah! Our first child, a son we named Robert, was born in 1958. Then our daughter June in 1961, and our youngest, a son named Thomas, in 1964. 3 children in 6 years, which is its own form of occupation, and I occupied myself with them fully and without resentment, because I had wanted to be a mother with a clarity and a certainty that some people have about vocations, and the reality of it matched the wanting in most of the ways that mattered. Walter and I were married for 43 years. I want to say that plainly and let it sit for a moment, because 43 years is a long time to share a life with another person, and it deserves acknowledgement before I tell you about losing it. 43 years of ordinary mornings and difficult months, and the particular rhythms that develop between two people who have been together long enough that each of them has become part of the other's architecture. The way a tree grows around a fence post until it is no longer possible to tell where one ends and the other begins. He died in 2000 from a stroke that arrived without warning on a Thursday morning in April while he was sitting in his chair reading the newspaper, which was what he always did on Thursday mornings, and which meant that the last ordinary moment of his life was also completely ordinary, unremarkable, exactly like every other Thursday morning that had preceded it. And I have found in the years since that this is more comforting than it initially seemed. He was doing what he always did. He was exactly himself, right up to the moment he wasn't. I was 64 years old when Walter died, and I want to describe the quality of that grief as precisely as I can, because it was unlike anything I had experienced before, and unlike what I would experience later, which is to say that different losses have different qualities of grief, and that understanding the differences has been one of the unexpected educations of my long life. The grief for Walter was the grief of a fundamental disorientation. He had been so woven into the fabric of my daily existence that his absence was not simply an absence. It was a restructuring, the way a building feels different when a load-bearing wall is removed, not just emptier but differently shaped, as if the space itself has changed its nature. I moved through the first year of that grief, the way I imagine most people move through the first year of losing a spouse, inefficiently and without much grace, doing what needed to be done, and not always knowing what needed to be done, and sometimes doing things that didn't need to be done, because doing things was preferable to sitting with the silence. My children were attentive and present in ways that I was grateful for, and that also occasionally exhausted me in the way that being witnessed in your grief can be exhausting when what you most need is privacy to actually have it. What carried me through that year, and what I want to be specific about, because specificity is what honesty requires, was not courage or resilience or any of the qualities that people tend to attribute to women of my generation who survive hard things. What carried me was the same thing my mother had stood on, the same thing that had been the structural foundation of my life since I was old enough to understand what it meant to have one. My faith. Not as a comfort exactly, though comfort was part of it. As a presence. As the persistent, unaroused sense that Walter had not simply ceased, that the 43 years of him were not simply erased by the Thursday morning in April, that whatever he was somewhere, and that the somewhere was not nowhere. I am aware that some of you hearing this will find that insufficient. I am aware that faith is not a universal resource, and that for some people it is simply not available. And I am not going to spend this conversation trying to argue anyone into it, because I don't think faith works that way, and because that is not what I'm here to tell you. What I am here to tell you is what it was for me, specifically and honestly, in the specific and honest terms of a woman who has carried it across 88 years and who has tested it against a great deal of weight and found it, repeatedly and not always easily sufficient. It was sufficient for Walter. And then, 6 years later, it was required again. My older sister Helen died in 2006. She was 74, and her death was preceded by a decline that lasted about 2 years, and that I watched with the particular helplessness of a sibling who knows someone so deeply and so long that watching them diminish is like watching a landscape you have known your entire life slowly drain of color. Helen and I had been close in the way that sisters can be close when they have shared an unusual childhood and survived it together, the kind of closeness that doesn't require maintenance because it is built into the structure of who you are, rather than into the effort of staying connected. When Helen died, I understood something about grief that I had not understood when Walter died, which is that different losses grieve different parts of you. Walter's death had grieved the part of me that was a wife, the part that had organized itself around a shared life and a shared bed and a shared understanding of what the days were for. Helen's death grieved something older and more foundational, The part of me that had existed before Walter, the girl from the Georgia town, who had shared a bedroom with her sister and learned the world in proximity to someone who was learning it at the same time. My younger sister May died in 2011. She was the youngest of the four of us, and she had always seemed, somehow, the most alive, the most insistently present in any room she occupied. And losing her produced a grief that was different again, sharper in some ways than the previous ones, perhaps because by then I was more practiced in the experience of grief and understood better what was coming, and could not prevent that understanding from arriving ahead of the actual loss. By the time May died, I was 75 years old, and I had lost my husband and both sisters and two of my closest friends. A woman named Evelyn, who had been my neighbor and companion for 30 years, and who died of cancer in 2009, and a man named Henry, who had been Walter's best friend, and who had, by extension, become a genuine friend of mine across 40 years of shared dinners and holidays and the ordinary social fabric of two families who had been woven together by proximity and affection. I had been to more funerals than I could count, and I had sat in more grief than I had previously understood a person could sit in without being consumed by it. I was not consumed by it. I want to tell you why. There is a thing that happens, in my experience, when you have lost enough people to understand grief, not as an event, but as a condition of long life, a thing that shifts in how the grief relates to the person you are grieving. In the early losses, the grief is about the absence. It is oriented around what is no longer there, the empty chair, the unringing phone, the particular silence that the specific person leaves in the specific places they used to occupy. That kind of grief is about subtraction, and it is brutal in a particular way that subtraction is brutal, the felt removal of something that was present and now is not. But something changes over time and with accumulation in what grief does and where it lives. I cannot tell you exactly when the change happened for me, because it was not a single moment, but a gradual shift. The way light changes in a room across an afternoon without you being able to identify the precise moment when it became something different. What I can tell you is that at some point in the long accumulation of my losses, the grief began to be less about absence and more about presence. The people I had lost were still present to me, not in any way that I would describe as supernatural, or as something I could explain to someone who hadn't experienced it, but as a genuine and continuous interior presence, the way someone can be present in a conversation without being in the room, through the weight of everything they have given you that you are still carrying. Walter is present to me every morning when I make the coffee the way he taught me to make it, stronger than I would have made it on my own, and better for being stronger. Helen is present to me whenever I find myself saying something that makes people laugh in a way that surprises them, because the ability to find the exact word that punctures a pretension was something I learned by growing up in proximity to her doing it better than anyone. May is present to me in my stubbornness, which is her stubbornness inherited and maintained, the refusal to accept that things are as limited as they sometimes appear to be. Evelyn is present to me in the garden because she is the one who taught me to pay attention to it. Henry is present to me every time I hear a baseball game because he was the one who explained the game to me with a patience and a pleasure in the explaining that made the game finally make sense after 40 years of watching it without quite understanding what I was watching. They are all here. That is what I am trying to tell you, not as a comfort I have constructed to make the loss bearable, as an actual experience of my daily life. The people I have loved and lost are continuously present in the specific ways that they shaped and changed and contributed to who I am, and that presence is not diminished by their physical absence, or not diminished in the ways I would have expected before I had lived long enough to know how grief actually works across decades. My faith has a name for this, and the name is communion. The belief that the connection between people who love each other is not dissolved by death, that what we are to each other persists in a form that is different from, but not lesser than what we were to each other in life. I hold that belief not as a doctrine, exactly, but as a lived experience that the doctrine gives language to. And the language has mattered because it has allowed me to understand what I was experiencing rather than simply experiencing it without a frame. But I want to say something carefully here, because I think it is important and because I don't want the specifically religious character of my own experience to obscure the more general truth that I believe is available to people regardless of whether they share my faith. The more general truth is this: the people we love change us, and the changes are permanent. And the permanence of the changes is a form of their continued existence in us. And that continued existence is real and available, and does not require any particular theological position to access. It requires only the willingness to look at yourself clearly enough to see where the people you have lost are still living, and to understand that seeing them there is not a symptom of grief, but its partial resolution. I have a granddaughter named Alice who is 31 years old and who lost her husband 2 years ago, unexpectedly, at an age when loss of that kind is entirely outside anything you had prepared yourself to carry. She called me the week after the funeral, not to be comforted exactly. She is a woman of considerable self-possession, and she knows her own needs clearly enough to ask for what she actually wants. But to talk to someone who had been where she was and had come out the other side, still recognizably herself, she asked me, directly and without preamble, how I had survived it. All of it. How I had gotten up every morning after losing the people I had lost and continued to be a person who was genuinely still in her own life. I told her what I am telling you. I told her that the people she had lost were not finished with her, that they had already changed her in ways she probably hadn't fully mapped yet, and that the changes were the form their continued presence took, and that her job now was not to find a way to move on from them, but to find a way to carry them forward, which was a different thing entirely. Moving on implies leaving something behind. Carrying forward means the opposite. It means that what they gave you travels with you, informs you, shows up in how you laugh, and what you notice, and which things matter to you when you strip everything back to what actually matters. And that this showing up is not haunting. It is company, and company of the best kind, the kind that knows you deeply because it is part of you. She was quiet for a long time after I said that. Then she said, "I think I understand," in the careful voice of someone who is not certain they understand, but who can feel the edge of something true and is holding it carefully to see if it holds. I told her it would take time, not to understand it abstractly, but to live into it in the way that grief eventually requires you to live into things, through the experience rather than around it. She calls me more now than she did before. We talk about her husband, about what she misses and what she finds of him in unexpected places. And I find in those conversations a reflection of my own experience across decades, the same process of discovery that I went through with Walter and Helen and May, and Evelyn and Henry and all the others. The gradual understanding that the people we love are not taken from us entirely, but transformed into something we carry, something that is now permanently part of the landscape of who we are. I want to talk about the particular loss I mentioned at the beginning, the one I said I don't think people discuss enough. When the last person who knew me young died, her name was Louise, and she had been my friend since we were 11 years old. What I lost was not only Louise, though losing Louise was its own profound grief. What I lost was the particular dimension of myself that only exists in the presence of someone who knew me before I became whoever I eventually became. Louise remembered me at 11, at 16, at 22 before Walter, at 35 with 3 children and a household, and a self that was recognizably adult, but still, to Louise, continuous with the girl she had known at the beginning. When she died, that version of me lost its last external witness. I have thought about that loss often in the 4 years since, because it has a quality that is different from any of the other losses, more intimate in some way and harder to name. It is not grief for Louise exactly, though it is partly that. It is grief for the part of yourself that can only exist in the presence of someone who has known you long enough to hold the whole arc of you, and the recognition that with Louise's death, that part has become entirely interior, entirely dependent on your own memory and your own sense of continuity, without the external confirmation that another person's knowing provides. And yet, what I find, sitting with that loss, is that Louise is no less present to me for the loss of her physical witnessing. She is present in the way I still see myself at 11 sometimes, in the way the girl I was remains available to my own memory, with a vividness that doesn't require external confirmation to be real. She is present in the way she always made me laugh, which is a way that has shaped how I approach certain kinds of difficulty, with an eye for the thing that is absurd in it, because Louise always found the absurdity in things and shared it with a generosity that made the finding available to everyone around her. I am 88 years old, and I get up every morning in a house that is quieter than any house I have lived in across my adult life, quieter by the measure of all the people who are no longer in it in the way they used to be. And I make the coffee the way Walter taught me to make it, and I look at the garden that Evelyn helped me understand how to tend, and I sit with all of them for a while before the day begins, not in a morbid way, not in the way of someone who is living in the past rather than the present, but in the way of someone who understands that the past and the present are not as separate as they can sometimes appear, that the people who shaped you are not confined to the years when they were physically present to do the shaping, and that every morning you wake up as someone who is made by more people than you can count is a morning that contains all of them in some real and ongoing sense alongside you. I don't think grief ends. I want to say that plainly because I think the idea that grief ends is one of the unhelpful ideas that circulates about it. The suggestion that there is a point at which you finish grieving and resume your life as if grief were an interruption rather than a permanent feature of a life that has loved people. What I think is more accurate is that grief changes, and that the change is not from grief to not grief, but from one kind of grief to another, from the sharp and disorienting grief of fresh loss to something that is still grief, but that has been integrated into the ongoing fabric of who you are, that has become part of the texture of your daily life, rather than an interruption of it. The integration takes time, more time than most people expect, and more time than our culture generally allocates, which is one of the things about grief that I wish were better understood by people who haven't had occasion to understand it yet. You cannot rush it, and you cannot manage it efficiently, and you cannot think your way through it to the other side. You have to go through it, which means living through the days that are simply hard and the nights that are harder, and the unexpected moments, the song on the radio or the particular light in the afternoon, or the smell of something cooking, that bring a person back so vividly that their absence becomes for a moment fresh again. Those moments still happen to me. After 60 years of grief in various forms, after decades of learning to carry what I carry, there are still moments when Walter or Helen or May or any of the others arrives in my present with a force and an immediacy that surprises me. And what I have found in the long practice of living with grief is that those moments are not failures of healing. They are not evidence that the grief is unresolved or that I am not managing it correctly. They are evidence of love, of the specific and irreversible love that you have for people who have been genuinely part of your life. And the love is worth the moments, worth the surprise of them, worth the brief and vivid return of the loss that they bring. My mother died in 1978 when I was 42 years old. She was 73, which seemed old to me at 42 and seems young to me now, which is one of the things that changes at 88, your relationship to the ages at which people die. She had been ill for about a year, which gave us time to say most of the things that needed to be said, and I am grateful for that time in ways that I have not always been able to be grateful for it, because the manner of a death affects the quality of the grief that follows in ways that are real and that take time to understand. What I said to my mother in the last months of her life was not dramatic and was not a summation. It was the ordinary conversation of a daughter who was visiting her mother and who understood that the visits were finite and who tried, in each one, to be actually there in the way that my mother's presence in my own life had always required me to be. Attentive, genuine, present to what was actually being exchanged rather than what was being managed. She died in a way that reflected who she was, with faith and with practicality and with a care for the people around her that characterized everything she did right up to the end, making sure the arrangements were sensible, making sure her children knew what she needed them to know, making sure that the things she had given us were clearly identified so that we could find them after she was gone. She gave me my faith. That is the most important thing she gave me, more important than any material thing, more foundational than any practical skill or piece of advice. She gave it to me not by instruction, but by example, by the daily practice of it across the years I watched her live. By the way, it informed everything she did without ever becoming separate from everything she did. The way a river doesn't announce itself as water, but simply as water in everything it does. I have given it, I hope, to my children and my grandchildren, in the same way she gave it to me, not as a doctrine, but as a way of being in the world, as an orientation toward something larger than the individual moment and the individual life that makes the individual moments and the individual life more bearable without making them less real. Robert has it, in his own form that is different from mine, but recognizable as the same thing. June has something that functions like it, though she would use different language. Thomas is still working out his own relationship to it, which is appropriate for a man who has always worked things out on his own schedule, and who I have learned to trust in that. Alice, my granddaughter, is also working it out. She called me last month on a Sunday evening, and she said, "Grandma, I found him today." Not in the way it sounds, not any kind of visitation or vision, but in the way I told her to look. She had been planting something in her garden, which she had taken up in the years since his death, and she had done something in the planting that he had taught her, some specific technique with the soil that she had watched him do a dozen times without registering it consciously, and her hands had done it without her deciding to, and in her hands doing it without her deciding to, she had found him. There, in the specific way her hands moved through the soil, the thing he had taught her was still living, still doing what he had done with it, still his in some essential sense, even though he was gone. That is what I mean by presence. That is the whole of what I am trying to tell you. The people we love teach us things that become part of how we move through the world, how we make coffee and tend gardens and find the absurdity in difficult things and move our hands through soil. And those things continue after the people who taught them to us are no longer here to watch us do them. And the continuation is real, and it is a form of their continued existence in us. And understanding that, truly understanding it in your body, rather than just in your mind, is the thing that made the grief bearable for me across 88 years of it. I am the last one left in most of the configurations that have mattered most to me across my life. The last of my family of origin. The last of the friendships I formed in the years before I became who I eventually became. The last person who remembers certain things that, when I am gone, will not be remembered by anyone. And I find, sitting with that fact as honestly as I can, that it does not frighten me the way I might have expected it to frighten me at a younger age. What I find instead is a kind of responsibility, a sense that what was given to me by all the people who came before me and who loved me and who changed me by their loving is something I have an obligation to pass forward, in whatever time I have remaining, to the people who are still here and still being shaped by the people around them. I pass it forward by being here, by being available, by picking up the phone when Alice calls on Sunday evenings and telling her the truth about what grief is and what love is and what the people we've lost continue to be, which is present, which is still themselves in us, which is not nothing and not nowhere, but here, in the strong coffee and the tended garden and the hands that know things the mind has forgotten it learned. I get up every morning. I make the coffee. I sit with all of them for a while. And then the day begins, and I am in it, fully and with genuine intention. because the people who taught me how to be in my own life are not finished teaching me, and as long as I am still here to learn from them, I intend to keep learning. That is the only thing that ever made the grief bearable. Not the absence of the grief, the presence of the people inside it, who are always, in every way that has ever mattered to me, still here.